All right, this is part 2 to our photography unit. In part 1, I stressed more of the elements of design and how they relate to photography. In this part 2, or unit 2, I'm going to stress the principles of design and how they relate to photography as best I can. Right. Now we've talked a little bit about the principles of design and how we use those to communicate visually using Microsoft Word. And my attempt here to use photography and how we communicate these principles to design. We'll see how successful I am with this. You should be familiar though with the principle of design referring to focal point or creating emphasis. Remember, emphasis is creation of a focal point. We've really stressed that principle of design a lot because it's such a powerful one. When you create anything like a slideshow or a document that has graphics on it, you want those important elements to stand out and the less important background elements to support the main elements or the subject and not distract from the main elements or subject. How many ways can we control emphasis or the focal point? We've talked about this in class before, using the elements of design. Color, shape, lines, pattern, space, texture, value, and size all can be used to emphasize a focal point or create one. In this case, not a super great picture, but the umbrella is the color red, which leads our eyes right there. The umbrella creates a shape, which kind of frames in our subject. The lines inside of the umbrella lead to our subject's face. The lines also create a pattern. There's some negative space off to the side, so the subject is framed off to the left side more, which emphasizes our subject. Maybe we would say the snowflakes kind of creates a texture for the whole image, and our subject and umbrella take up a good piece of the frame, although you might say they could have taken up more of the frame. So all of those elements are present, to some degrees more successful than others. As far as size goes, I think you'll find you'll be very successful creating a focal point and a good look for your photos by filling the frame up with your subject. In this case, the little boy takes up a good chunk of the frame. And the background, the negative space has been blurred to emphasize the subject even more. We've got value going on, a contrast of value, contrast of dark and light tones, which helps this image as well. The darkness of the sweater versus the lightness of his hair and his hands creates a nice blend of tones, dark and light. And again, I mentioned the space, positive and negative. The negative space helps us focus on the positive space. It does not distract us. When you blur the background like this intentionally with a camera, you need a pretty expensive camera to accomplish this with a long lens. You can also accomplish this in Photoshop, which we'll get to later, but this is called a depth of field effect. It's really shallow depth of field where you blur the background so your subject stands out. All right, get your shot list out and add shot 15, the umbrella shot. I would like you to take the umbrella shot where only the person and the umbrella are in the frame. There's nothing else in the frame. That way you're using the color of the umbrella as an instant background. And I'd like you to try this shot with the flash on, which we'll call a fill flash, because in some cases you wouldn't think you need to use a flash, but adding that flash will brighten up the background, which might create a nicer background. You might try angling your subject a little bit, and then also try spinning the umbrella really fast, or excuse me, having your subject spin the umbrella really fast. And sometimes you can get a blur effect with the umbrella moving, which is kind of a cool background in itself. All right, moving on to a different principle of design, contrast. How many ways can you show contrast? About the same number of ways you can create a focal point. You can use color, shape, lines, pattern, space, texture, value, and size to portray or convey the idea or principle of contrast. In this case, the value. The dark and light tones in this picture create an instant impression of contrast. In this picture, contrast is created a number of different ways. The smoothness of the leaf compared to the rough texture of the background, the size of the leaf compared to the background, the bright yellow compared to the drab gray, and you can probably notice a few others. Here we've got contrast in the face, dark and light tones are contrast in value. This was taken in our portrait studio. Again, contrast on the one side of the face with the other. Might be too dark for some of you. Depends on the photographer how much contrast they want on the face. Leonardo da Vinci, like I've said before in class, kind of a good model for photographers. Notice the subject is angled. She's looking over her shoulder slightly. He really liked severe contrast from the dark shades here to the brightness of the face. You might say that both sides of the face are about the same, but notice he's got this contrast here on the cheek. His famous photo, there's a little more contrast on this side of the face. Notice how she's angled. Notice how much of the frame she is taking. Number 16, window portrait. Talking about key and fill light with this one. And this also applies to the idea of contrast, or the principle of contrast. The key light in this example is your main source of light. In this case, the window shining in creates the light value on his face. But there's still light in the room, although it's not as powerful as the window, and this is called the fill light. And sometimes photographers will add another light that's smaller or less intense just to give the shadow face a little bit more lighter of value or tone. But a lot of photographers like that difference between the white and the dark, or light and dark values. In this case, the key light was over here on the left, very bright, and on the right, you probably say there was very little fill light. Maybe there wasn't any use, just a little bit of the light bouncing off the wall of the room. Okay, shot number 17, juxtaposition. This is the idea of contrast as well, principle of contrast. There's lots of ways to show contrast besides value or color or line or shapes, the elements, but there's also how you arrange your subjects and what your subjects are. In this case, the juxtaposition, the contrast, positioning one subject next to the other creates an immediate sense of contrast. So this is the famous picture called Tank Man from the Tiananmen Square incident in China. Boy, when was that? I can't give you the date, I can't remember. But there's a lot of famous pictures of him facing off these tanks. And the tank didn't want to run over him, or the tank driver didn't want to run over him. And so the tank would move, and Tank Man would move too and stand in front of the tank. He was facing down the Chinese military, this weak, frail little person against these huge, powerful tanks. That's an immediate contrast called juxtaposition. You're putting two subjects next to each other that are obviously different, and there's lots of ways to do this. I don't have an example for you, but putting a young subject in the same picture as an older subject, like a grandma or grandpa with their grandchild that was just born, is another example of juxtaposition, where you're contrasting age. In this case, it's contrasting maybe power. So you're going beyond the obvious elements, and you're contrasting an idea.